Yuri Boyka's name echoed through every corner of the prison, a legend whispered with both reverence and fear. In the brutal world of underground prison fighting, Boyka stood unrivaled, a force of nature that had crushed 38 opponents without a single loss. His victories were legendary. His opponents often left broken in ways that made the fiercest of warriors tremble. A title, once given, could never be taken back, and Boyka was not only the best but also feared as the most complete fighter in the world. Boyka's reputation went far beyond just his raw power. He was a master of all forms of combat. His fists could shatter bone, but it was his legs, his lethal kicks, that set him apart. Every part of his body was a weapon, from his powerful knees to his devastating punches. But it was the way he fought with every muscle, every motion, that left his opponents with no chance. Boyka didn't just fight, he destroyed. He made an art of breaking spirits as much as bones. The prison walls were lined with former champions, men who once thought they were the best but were now humbled, having faced the overwhelming power of Boyka. The fear of facing him in the ring hung over the entire facility like a dark cloud. The prisoners were in awe of Boyka, and the guards treated him like royalty. To step into the ring with Boyka was to sign your own death warrant, and even the toughest men knew it. Boyka was not just feared for his skill, but for the reputation he had earned. He was a man who had survived countless battles, who had fought and won against the most dangerous criminals. He was respected not only as a fighter, but as a leader within the prison, a king among men. His fights were a spectacle, his every move sharp, calculated, and deadly. The prisoners who watched him fight were reminded of their own helplessness. Every victory added to the myth that was Boyka, and soon, he became more than just a man. He was an untouchable champion. George Chambers had never wanted to become part of this world. He was a heavyweight boxer, big, strong, and skilled in his own right, but fighting in a prison ring was not his plan. He had been a champion in the outside world, a respected athlete, feared by opponents. George wasn't a fighter by necessity, but by choice. He fought for the love of the sport, for the adrenaline, the rush of victory, and the sweet taste of glory. But that was before everything changed. George had been framed, his once promising career shattered by a web of lies. His manager, a man he trusted, sold him out to the highest bidder, ensuring George would land in the very prison where Boyka reigned. The system had betrayed him, leaving George with no other choice but to fight his way through the prison's brutal and unforgiving world. He had been brought to this hellhole by Gaga, a ruthless mobster who controlled the betting rings and ran the underground fights within the prison. Gaga saw potential in George. The big American could be a money-making machine, the ticket to bigger payoffs and greater wealth. But George didn't know it yet. His arrival was part of a much bigger plan, Gaga's plan. The mob boss needed George to face Boyka and win, and he was willing to manipulate the odds however necessary. George stood out in the prison for many reasons. He was larger than most men, and though he was a boxer by trade, his imposing size and strength made him a target. To most of the other prisoners, George was a giant, too strong, too intimidating. But to Boyka, George was just another fighter who would eventually fall. The first time George laid eyes on Boyka was in the prison eatery. Boyka walked in, his usual air of dominance radiating as the room fell silent. The other prisoners immediately stood to show respect. But George, unmoved by Boyka's presence, remained seated. This small act of defiance caught the eye of Boyka, who stared at George with interest. George was not impressed by Boyka's reputation. He had fought men who were just as strong, just as dangerous. In that moment, something clicked for both men. They were on a collision course, and neither would back down. Boyka's men immediately moved to intimidate George, but George wasn't having any of it. He stood up, towering over the other prisoners and glaring at Boyka. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The tension was palpable. George was a big man, and even Boyka, despite his reputation, knew he would be a formidable opponent. "What's your name, big man?" Boyka asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and challenge. "George," George replied coolly, his voice deep and firm. "I'm not interested in bowing to anyone." Boyka smirked, amused by George's boldness. "You'll learn to respect me," he said, "or you'll regret it." The next few moments were like a storm ready to break. A quick push from Boyka's men, and George reacted with speed that surprised even the seasoned fighters in the room. He shoved them back, throwing a sharp jab that landed on one of their chins. But before the fight could escalate any further, the guards rushed in, breaking the tension with their heavy presence. "If you want to fight," Boyka said, his voice cutting through the noise, "do it in the ring." It was an open challenge, a statement that Boyka wasn't going to let this thing slide. He had ruled the prison for too long to let someone like George walk in and show him up. George didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, knowing that this wasn't over. The fight would come, and when it did, Boyka would learn that George Chambers wasn't afraid of anyone. George's first fight with Boyka arrived sooner than expected. Word had spread fast throughout the prison that the big American boxer had stepped up to challenge Boyka. The betting ring had exploded, with gamblers pouring their money into Boyka's victory. But Gaga had his own plans, and he knew that a win for George would make him rich. The fight began with both men circling each other. George knew Boyka was dangerous, but he wasn't backing down. They exchanged blows. Boyka's kicks, fast and precise, and George's heavy punches, landing with a thud every time they collided. Boyka's ability to use his legs effectively was his greatest advantage, and George quickly learned that his fists alone would not be enough. But the fight was far from one-sided. George was a boxer, and he had the power to hit hard. His size and strength gave him an edge, but Boyka's skill in striking with his legs was proving difficult to overcome. The first round ended in a draw, with neither man giving an inch. As the bell rang to signal the end of the first round, George and Boyka stood in their corners, glaring at each other, exhausted but determined. Sweat dripped from their brows, but neither man showed signs of backing down. The crowd of prisoners surrounding the ring roared with excitement. The clash of two titans was exactly what they had been waiting for. George's breath came in steady gasps, his fists still tight and ready. But as he glanced over at his corner, he noticed something was wrong. A figure in the shadows moved quickly, slipping something into his water bottle. His corner man, the old man who had taken on the role of his trusted coach, was busy checking the fight's progress. George didn't think much of it at the time, but the suspicion lingered in the back of his mind. He took a long swig of the water before returning to the ring, feeling a strange heat spread through his body, his head growing foggy. At first, he thought it was just the exhaustion from the fight catching up with him. But as the second round began, he realized something was terribly wrong. His limbs felt heavier, his vision blurry. Every time Boyka launched a kick, George couldn't react fast enough. He felt slow, sluggish, as though his body was fighting against him. Boyka, sensing the shift in momentum, moved in with deadly precision, landing powerful strikes to George's midsection. George's body crumpled with each hit, but he refused to fall. He pushed through the haze, his fists swinging in desperate retaliation. But it wasn't enough. Boyka's attacks grew fiercer, and by the end of the second round, George was on the ground, barely conscious, beaten and battered. The bell rang, and the crowd erupted in cheers for Boyka, their champion. George's body was limp as he was dragged to his corner. In the darkness of his mind, George's thoughts raced. He couldn't understand what had happened. His body was betraying him. What was wrong? It wasn't until later, when he woke up in a cold sweat in his prison cell, that the truth became clear. An old man, a friend from the prison who had become George's ally, visited him and revealed the truth. Boyka didn't do this, the old man said softly, his face grim. It wasn't Boyka who brought you down, it was them. They drugged your water, George. The words hit George like a freight train. His stomach turned, his anger flaring to life. He had been betrayed. Boyka may have won the fight, but it wasn't because he was the better fighter. It was because someone had poisoned him, manipulating the odds. "I'll kill them," George growled, clenching his fists, his knuckles white with fury. The old man warned him, "Don't go after Boyka. He didn't know, but you need to confront those who did this to you." Fueled by a rage he had never known, George stormed through the prison halls, determined to find the people responsible for his poisoning. He found Boyka in the gym, surrounded by his men. The moment Boyka saw George, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "What's this?" Boyka asked, his voice cool, but his posture tense. "Are you coming for revenge?" George stepped forward, fist clenched. "Did you drug me, Boyka?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Did you sabotage our fight?" Boyka stood tall, unyielding. "I didn't drug you," he said, his eyes narrowing as he took in George's appearance. "If I wanted to win, I'd do it with my own strength. I didn't poison you." George's anger didn't subside, but something in Boyka's eyes made him hesitate. The champion was speaking the truth. "Then why am I like this?" George demanded. "Why was I weak in the ring?" Boyka's expression shifted, and he glanced over at his men, who avoided eye contact. That was all the confirmation George needed. Boyka may not have known, but his men had done it, and they would pay for it. In a fury, Boyka turned on his men. "Who did this?" he shouted, his voice laced with venom. The men cowered, and one by one, they pointed to a small, shadowy figure in the corner. The man was the one who had poisoned George's water. Boyka marched over to him, grabbed him by the throat, and without another word, snapped his neck. "Never cheat a fight again," Boyka growled, his voice a deadly whisper. "If you want to fight, fight with honor. If you want to play dirty, you're dead to me." George stood still, watching the scene unfold. His anger hadn't subsided, but the sense of betrayal he had felt earlier began to dissipate. Boyka had punished the men who'd tried to sabotage him. George walked away from the gym, but his mind was still burning with the desire for revenge. He wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The final fight between George and Boyka was inevitable. The whispers had spread throughout the prison that Boyka's reign as the unbeatable champion was being challenged by a new contender. George had the size, the strength, and the drive to take Boyka down, but the first 2 rounds had shown him just how deadly Boyka's leg work could be. His kicks were fast, precise, and brutal. George had to adapt, or he would lose again. Krot, the old man who had become George's friend, saw the struggle in his eyes. "You have to defeat Boyka, George," Krot said, his voice low but firm. "If you don't, you'll never leave this place. This is your chance, your freedom." George stared at the ground for a long moment, his mind racing. He had fought for respect before, but this fight was different. It wasn't about proving himself. It wasn't about victory or glory. It was about survival. He needed to win, or he would never leave the prison. The final round had arrived, and George knew that he had to become something more than just a boxer. He had to fight for his life. The 3rd round began with a roar from the crowd, and both fighters were already bloodied and battered. Boyka came in with his signature move, his legs slicing through the air like blades. But this time, George was ready. He anticipated Boyka's movements, dodging the kicks and countering with his fists. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was fighting with purpose, with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The fight was brutal. Boyka's blows were fast and painful, but George refused to back down. He had learned from Krot how to deal with an opponent who relied on speed and agility. He focused on Boyka's legs, the source of his power. With a roar, George landed a crushing blow to Boyka's knee. Boyka collapsed to the ground, his legs shattered. The crowd gasped in shock as the once unbeaten champion writhed in pain. Boyka tried to stand, but it was over. The fight had ended, and George Chambers was victorious. The cheers of the crowd were deafening as George stood over Boyka, his chest heaving with exertion. Boyka, the undefeated champion, had been defeated, and the prison had a new legend. But for George, the victory was bittersweet. He had won, yes, but the cost was high. He had fought for his freedom, and now it was time to take it. Gaga had won big, thanks to George's victory, and he wasted no time in paying George's share of the winnings. But George didn't care about the money. He wasn't interested in wealth or fame. "No money," George said firmly. "I want Krot free." Gaga blinked in surprise, but the mob boss knew that George had earned his freedom. With a nod, he agreed, and George used the money from the fight to secure Krot's release from the prison. Together, George and Krot walked out of the prison, leaving behind a world of violence and corruption. George had won his freedom, not just for himself, but for his friend. And as they stepped into the daylight, George knew that he had finally won the one thing that mattered most, his life.